Okay, today we're going to be speaking about, meat, which is Glatt and Beis Yosef, which is to say we're going to talk about how lungs are checked to see if an animal's a treifa, and the different tolerances and standards that are used in this kind of meat. Okay, so first let me give just a drop of an introduction, and that is that the lungs of a kosher. Okay, before even giving the introduction, let me just say we're talking about animals specifically. Treifas that are checked for birds are a whole different breed, something very different, and that will be miuch the next time when we talk about treifa poultry issues for that have to do with poultry, and in this context, the word glatt really only applies to meat. It's become colloquially used even for birds also, which are on a high standard of Kashrus, but really the term really only fits for animals. Okay, so as I was about to say, an animal, a lung of a kosher mammal has 7 major lobes. The lung is divided into 7 major sections. 2 larger lobes that are called the umois, 5 upper lobes that are called unois, and plus there's one little una, which is in the center of the lung, and it's called the varda because it looks like a rose. Okay, now the Gemara says about these unois and umois, it's all the same. About the unas, that hani tarti unois uni desrichin hadadi, 2 unois that are connected to each other, that are touching or connected to each other. Less lahu bedikas. There's no way to check them. Meaning the animal is a treifa, and there's nothing to do. There's no way to look at them and say this animal is somehow not a treifa. The Gemara says, this that there's a problem when the 2 unas are touching each other, are stuck to each other, that they are. That there's a problem, the animals are treifa. It's if they're not in line with each other, like one right next to each other. If these are 2 unas that are actually next to each other and they happen to be stuck together, that's the way they grow, and there's no problem, there's nothing wrong. The animal's not a treifa. Okay, so this is the Gemara that tells us about a sircha, what we call a sircha. Now the Gemara doesn't use the word sircha in the term in a noun. It's talking about srichin hadad. They're attached to each other. It's describing how they're attached. But we use the word sircha to describe when there's some kind of a mucus or fibers or something that connects, that's attached to part of the lung. Again, one of the unas or one of the umois. And that's what we call that. We call that a sircha. That's not exactly how the Gemara uses it. That's how we call it. Okay, now, the Gemara I mentioned had said something about kesidron and shleik kesidron. There's many details that we're not going to talk about what's considered kesidron. Again, kesidron means it's mutter. If they're next to each other, if 2 unas that are supposed to be next to each other are srichin hadadi, that's fine. Plus, the Ashkenazim have many chumras, basically to ask almost every sircha, except in a very specific area where the lobes just start to separate from each other. That's the one case that Ashkenazim are meko, but by and large, Ashkenazim are machmer on many things to consider them shleik kesidron, or in general to be machmer. Okay, now this that I'm going to mention an important machlokes. We'll hear one nafkamin about it later. An important machlokes is that Rashi says the reason why animal is a treifa if it has a sircha is because if there's a sircha, that means we know that there's a hole underneath it, and a hole in the lung makes the animal to a treifa. So that's how Rashi learns. And Tosfos learns no, it doesn't mean that there's necessarily a hole, but it means that there's gonna be a hole. If there's already a sircha, the unas are srichin hadadi, that means there's gonna be a hole here soon. And we say kol amid linkov kenakov dami. It's as if the hole already exists. So there might be no hole today, but by the fact that there is srichin hadadi tells us there's gonna be a hole in the future, and that's why the animal's a treifa, because it will have a hole. Okay, now how do there are 3 steps to check an animal to see if it has any sirchas. The first is you have to get access to the diaphram, or in Hebrew we call it the tarpash. Okay, the diaphram is a piece of skin, it's a muscle that separates between, when the animal's standing up, it's between the front half of the animal and the back half of the animal. The front half of the animal is where the lungs and the heart are, and the back half of the animal are all the digestive organs and and things like that. So in order to get to the lungs, you have to get access to this diaphragm. You have to be able to get to the diaphragm so we could then, we'll see this in a minute, get through it to get through to the lungs that are underneath it. So the way it works in practice is the animal's already shechted, of course. It's hanging with its head facing down, and the belly of the animal is facing the people who are working on it. And what they do is they make a cut a vertical cut down the middle of the carcass on the part that's facing them, on the belly side of it, and they cut it down till they cut it down down the middle, and so they can pull out the digestive system, like all the intestines and the stomachs, the liver, and certain other organs that are in that part of the animal, and that what we call the back hair for the animal. Now it's the back hair for the animal. All the things that are behind the diaphragm, all that gets pulled out and put to the side. And so now we have access. Now you can the person who's there is able to now see and do something with the diaphragm. We're going to talk in a second what he's going to do. Now the goal here, this whole idea here, is we're trying to get to the lungs, and it will be sort of defeating the purpose if in getting to the lungs we knocked off any sirchas that are there. We have to find the sirchas. So we're trying to get to the lungs and find the sirchas, but not somehow mess them up and make them not existent anymore. So that's not so easy. Because the way the operators would like to treat an animal, meaning the way they treat it when there's no kosher shechita going on, is they don't just cut down halfway down the animal; they cut down the whole from top to bottom, make a vertical cut all the way down through the bottom till the neck. But if you would do that, then you'd be cutting into the area that holds the lungs. The lungs are there are ribs surrounding the thoracic cavity. It's the ribs surrounding where the lungs and the heart are. So there's the ribs around it on basically on all sides except for one side that has the tarpash, the diaphragm on for where we're standing now is on the top. So if you would cut down all the way through this where the ribs come together is called the sternum. If you cut down through that sternum, which is what they would want to do. That's what they would do if this was not a shechita. Then you're going to good chance you're going to be cutting off all kinds of sirchas that are there. It would be basically impossible to find sirchas afterwards. So what they do is, Moshe, based on something from Ikras Moshe, is what they do is they cut down only till where they only cut down till the diaphragm, starting from the back of the, so to speak, it's down the center all the way down till it hits where the diaphragm is, and then they stop. Okay. Later, once the bodek is the bodek pnim, we're going to talk about in a second. Once the bodek pnim is finished, then they bring out a saw and they cut down all the way through the sternum. Okay. So first what we did so far is we talked about step 1, which is to get access to the tarpash, to the diaphragm. Step 2 is what's called bedikas pnim, checking the animal inside while the lungs are still inside the animal. And what they do is like this: the diaphragm is, as I said, it's now like stretching across horizontally, and it's we'll say it's like a muscle. And what they do is the bodek makes a cut on each side of it, like not on the edges, sort of, let's say a few inches in, one on each side. And what he does is then he sticks his hand into the hole that he just made, one side at a time. And he could then touch each of the umos or unos that are on that side that he's on. So if he's on the right side, he touches the unos on that side, and then the left side, he checks the vardo also while he's at it. And what he does is like this: if he feels in his feeling around that he can't see what he's doing, he just has his hand stuck through this hole to touch the lungs. If while his hands are in there, he feels something that he knows is a sircha, it's like obvious that there's a very strong, big thing holding together unas that are not supposed to be connected to each other, the animal's not kosher. It's treif. Easy. That's so to speak easy. The bodek pnim says the animal is treif. But sometimes he finds no sirchas while he's poking around, or he finds something that he's not sure. Remember, he's just touching with his hands. He can't see what he's doing there. So when in that case he will tell the next person, the bodek chutz, we're going to talk about him in a second, tell the bodek chutz, this is what I found. They often use cards to describe, I found on this spot, on this una, is where I found the follow. This is, check over here, see more carefully, because there's something that was fishy over here, I wasn't sure about that. Okay, so then what they do is the carcass itself and the lungs and anything else taken out of the animal, like the liver or the tongue or the tail, all the parts that are connected to this animal get tagged, so you know which animal this belonged to. So this is animal 42. So there's a mark of a 40, there's a tag of a 42 on all these different parts. So this way, when the final decision is made whether animal 42 was a treif or was kosher, you'll be able to, all the parts will have the same status. So let's say the liver, you want to know, is this liver from an animal that was a treifa or not a treifa? So you have to wait until a final decision is made, and then at that point they'll know, okay, number 42 was a treifa or was not a treifa, and of course you have to track that and keep on top of that. And then at that point they could say, okay, liver 42 is on the kosher side or on the treifa side, and the tail and the cheeks and all the different parts that were separated out of the animal are like that. Okay, so now the lung is now taken from the bodek pnim is finished what he had to do, and they take the lung on to somebody else called the bodek chutz. He's this is step 3. He's the one who checks the animal externally. So he gets the lung. Once he gets the lung, now as I mentioned before, they use the saw to cut through the sternum, and now the animal goes on to be processed further while the bodek chutz is doing his job. And at this point, we don't know for sure whether the animal is kosher or treif. Again, unless he found a treif in the pnim. So the bodek chutz checks the lungs again. He's now checking outside. He could visually look at the lung. He could see what he's looking at, and he looks and he makes a general check. But he particularly, of course, pays attention to places that the bodek pnim told him to look at. He said, "Have a look on the mispatzelas. Check over on this edge of that to check if there's something there." So he's paying special attention to that. And aside from actually looking and touching, we'll talk exactly what he does. But aside from the thing that he does, he will, when he finds something that's suspicious, he will inflate the lung and put a little water onto the spot where he was suspected there might have been a hole. And what happens is once the lung is inflated, there's pressure coming from the inside of the ear trying to get out, and if there in fact is a hole, then you would see the ear bubbling out on the water that he puts there. So he'll just cup his hands around the spot that he's concerned about. The ear will be trying to burst out, and the water will be there. Usually they just let water in. There's usually water flowing there, and they put water onto it to see if it bubbles out, see if there's a hole. Okay, now, so this bodek chutz makes his inspection. He checks all around. The meaning in the United States actually is that they inflate every lung, even if there weren't anything suspicious on it. But he checks it out, and once the bodek chutz has checked the animal, now a final decision is made what if the animal is kosher or treif, and whether it's Glatt, Beis Yosef. We're going to talk about those kind of statuses in a second. But whatever it is, he will then tell a mashgiach, whose job it is to keep track of all these parts, that animal 42, let's say he decided animal 42 is Glatt. Okay, so now that they have records are kept that number 42 is Glatt, and all the parts that belong to number 42 will now, going forward, will be able to be designated as being from a kosher animal, from an animal that was Glatt. Okay, so that's how the procedure for how the checking is done. So now let's go to the actual checking itself of the animals. Now, I mentioned before, and the Gemara says that there is no way, less l'hubedika, there's no way to check, if you have unas that are shrichim l'hadadi, there's no way to check to make them kosher. So, even so, the Gemara said that in the later generations, as things went on, 5 different ways people came up with of how to check for sirchas, and 4 of them are what we have to talk about. One of them is totally, no one knows how to do it anymore. So 4 that we have to talk about. The first two are going to go together, and of that, the first one is called hachnasas yad bodek, which means this is for the bodek pnim. If he notices something, but just by sticking his hand and just by pushing his hand past it, the whole thing gets dislodged, then that's considered the animal's kosher. And if hachnasas yad bodek knocks this thing off, then it was nothing. That doesn't really count, and that's a tzad to say that the animal is not a treifa. And related to that is something called hagbah. This is for the bodek chutz. He wedges his finger underneath the sircha and lifts it up very slightly without pulling on the flesh. And if just that little bit, just a little hagbah makes the whole thing fall off, makes the whole sircha snap, then the animal's kosher. Even if some pieces get left behind on the lung, but if by just lifting it up makes it snap in half, like just break apart, then that's not considered something we call a sircha. The term that the Beis Yosef use that is called a rear. Okay, it's like a new term to describe something that's mucusy, but it's not what we're to the level of what we call a sircha. So the Shulchan Aruch is not very excited about. He's not very happy to rely on this. The Gemara says that there's no way to check them, But he says if the animal belonged to a yid, so I guess that means it's a hefsid, and the bodek is what he calls a Yareh Hashem Mirabim. There's a special high level of Yireh Shamayim for this person. Then he says you could be samach on one of these two bedikas as a way to say that what you're looking at is not really a sircha. Now, that's the first two. The third is something called miuch mishmush, which is where you take this mucus or whatever is on there, and the bodek rubs it and rolls it and he manipulates it to see if maybe he can get it to dissolve. That's called miuch mishmush. The Mechaber was very against it, and he says, "Mamash, you're feeding treifas to people if you matter a sircha based on that." And the Rama says, "Okay," he says, in cases that have some meruba, you could be samech on it. We'll talk more about this in a second. And Lamaisa, for hundreds of years, that's what most Ashkenazi communities did. They were samech on miuch mishmush to be matter animals and say this animal is not a treifa. If the sircha came off with miuch mishmush, they consider it not to be a sircha. Now the fourth one is called klipah, and that is you pull and peel the sircha and try to peel it off the lung. And if you can get it off, and then you inflate the lung and see if there's a hole. And if there's no hole, then the animal is considered kosher. Okay, so miuch mishmush was you try to dissolve the sircha, while klipah means you try to you carefully peel it off, and if it comes off without any without making a hole, meaning you check afterwards, if it didn't make a hole, the animal is kosher. This type of bedika was created or discovered by a shaykhid in the year about 1700 in Prague. Of course, it's not in the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch was written about 150 years before that, and many of the Practicum were against this, especially because remember I told you before, and the Tosfos says that sirchas are not a sign that there is a hole, but a sign that a hole is going to be here. So they say, so what? You peeled it off and there was no hole. Big deal, but there's going to be a hole tomorrow. Eventually, there's going to be this thing was going to turn into a hole, and that's enough to make it into a treifa. So especially according to the sheet of Tosfos, it's hard to hear how klipah could work. But Lamaisa, with time, it became more accepted, and it came a lot based on a svar from Alexander Sender Margolis, who said that if you could peel it off without making a hole, then that tells us that this sircha was not actually on the lung. It's not on the flesh of the lung. It was on a membrane that's on top of the lung. And what you're doing is that you're peeling off the membrane. You're not peeling off the sircha. So it's not on the lung at all. So only a sircha that's on the lung itself is the problem, not a sircha that's on the membrane that's on the lung. And the membrane is its own separate shaila, but that itself does not make it a treifa. So other people were not so thrilled about that either. But Lamaisa, in the end, the Chassam Sofer was soymech on it, and that made it more mekubal. And nowadays, this is the kind of bedika that people are soymech on. There aren't many people doing miuch mishmush anymore. Really, people nowadays are doing klipah and are saying being matir animals that have what appeared to be sirchas because they did klipah, and the klipah told them that the animal we could call this a rear, we could call this not a sircha, and we could say that it's matir. Okay, so now we've gone through these 4 different ways to check. We figured out how to get to check for sirchas, and 4 different ways to check. 2 of which the Mechaber said to be samech on only makam, if it was a yid and a yari Hashem rabim, miuch mishmush that people used to do, that the Mechaber was very against, and klipah that lamaisa is what people are doing nowadays to make an animal kosher. So now let's talk about what makes it glatt. So the Rama said that we only samech on miuch mishmush only in case of hefsim meruba. The Shach says, nah, we'll make it completely about it. And as I said, for hundreds of years, that's what people were being samech on, and they were makel to eat meat, or at least Ashkenazim were makel to eat meat based on miuch mishmush. And what happened was, over the years, for all those years, there were 2 types of meat. There was some meat that had no sirchas at all. Okay, 0, none at all. Okay, and they had no sirchas at all. That was amazing. But most of the animals had sirchas, and they were makel based on miuch mishmush. So they used a term glatt or Chalak. Glatt is a Yiddish word that means smooth, or Chalak means smooth. It was smooth meat, meaning there was lungs. It was lungs that had no sirchas on them at all. And those are the ones for the people who wanted to be extra makbid, like the Rama had said. But most of the world was eating meat that was not glatt. because that's all there was that was available. You couldn't get meat it was very, very rare to find an animal that was taka like that. And some people call that Beis Yosef meat because it was meat that even the mechaber would have held of, because it didn't have to be some on any kind of bedikas like that. Okay, so and all the rest of the meat was just called kosher. It was not glatt; it was just called kosher, and most people, especially Ashkenazim, that's what they eat. So to give a picture of how rare it was to have glatt meat was that in about the year 1900, a sefer called Beis David, a sefer on shechita, he quoted another sefer called Das HaZevach, and that person wrote that in 44 years that he's involved in shechita and these and meat and things like that, he says he can't be sure that he even one time saw an animal that had no sirchas on it. Okay, just give you a picture of how unusual or uncommon it was to have an animal that was truly glatt. And Rav Natan Greenblatt once told us that Moshe said he didn't understand it, how in America there was so much meat that was glatt. You walk into the supermarket, all this meat is called glatt. He says when he was back in Lubnan, in Russia or Belarus, when he was back in Russia, they would shecht about 10 animals a week. And he said maybe there would be one glatt animal every 3 weeks. Okay, he says, and sometimes even months that they would go by that there was no animals that was really glatt. So those are just two examples. Those are two examples that are showing us how rare it is that an animal that's a couple of years old, to have no sirchas at all. Now, it's true that in South America there are animals that are completely free of sirchas, one after the other. The animals are all very clean and fine, but from kosher perspective, that's an exception. That's not the rule. So what's the answer to what Moshe said? Moshe wanted to know how could it be that the stores have so much glatt meat when here he is, he knew from his experience that it just doesn't exist. It just isn't so much meat that's really glatt. So the answer, if you look back in this sefer Das HaZevach that I quoted, that I mentioned before, that's where we're going to find the answer. He says listen. He says it was like so impossible to find meat that was really glatt. So they made a decision and they decided that anytime you can get off a sircha without any special skill, we'll call that glatt. His words like this: any sircha, a light sircha that comes off without any special skill that you know what to do with it, nikra glatt kosher, we call it glatt kosher. So in other words, Ramah says it's a good idea to always have glatt, and people wanted to do that, but there wasn't glatt meat to go around. So they came up with this thing and they said, you know what? Even if it's not really glatt, it has these light sirchas. We'll call those glatt also. We made up a new term. We changed the rules and we call that glatt also. And he says also, the Dakos says, there's other people who had this other idea. They said, you know what? If there's up to 3 of these light sirchas, you could call it glatt. Now that has no meaning. Well, what do you mean 3? Where does 3 come from? Either it's a sircha or it's not a sircha. You could have 100 or none. What's the difference if it's 3? But that's also some kind of a compromise to say, if it's not so bad, that we'll call glatt. That'll be like a better standard. We'll call that glatt also. And the same idea that you see from this Das HaZevach, that there's this compromise to give this new meaning to the word glatt. You could see in the Satmarov, Rabbi Yolish, who writes in 2 different places. One, he's writing, and he says that before World War II, where Yidden lived in Europe, the butchers were under the Hashgachah of the community or the Rav, and they would sell meat that was glatt and meat that was not glatt. And most of the people ate the not glatt, and some, Yechidei Skula would eat only the glatt meat, but that was considered normal. That was a typical thing. You walk into the butcher shop, and there was glatt meat and there was not glatt meat. Then in the United States, the things changed a little bit. And they use a new term, and they called it kelbel glatt, which means a kelbel is a young calf. So this is an animal whose lungs were so smooth they were like a young calf. That was the real glatt. And then they made up and then another thing was called kula glatt. It was the lenient version, the kula digga version of glatt, and that was for all the rest of the meat. Okay, so in other words, what would have been called back in Satmar in Europe would have been called glatt and not glatt. Over here we call it kelbel glatt and kula glatt. Okay, but in other words, but all these things are saying is that it's not possible. In fact, it's not possible to have so much meat that's really is glatt, really has no sirchas at all. That's really not possible. So the term that we use nowadays that's called glatt doesn't really mean that. The term that we call glatt is really not glatt, which is fine, which Ashkenazim ate for hundreds of years. That's what they've been eating. But it's not really the standard of what would have been called glatt 100 years ago. Okay, now, if I'm telling you that the word glatt doesn't really mean animals have perfectly clean, how would you know if you want to actually get the meat that taka has no sichas? If the term glatt doesn't mean what it's supposed to mean anymore, how will you get the meat that has no sichas if you want to be from those yechidei skula? So most people would assume, well, I know how to do that, because go to the store and you see that some of the meat is marked as being Chalak or Beis Yosef. Okay, so which means that sounds like they're trying to say we're on the higher standard, that we're this kelbal glatt, we're this glatt, but that's so clean as mamish that the real traditional what's supposed to be glatt is. Okay, and there are hashgachas that do like that, but you should know, even though there are hashgachas that do that, which is more, seems to me more straightforward and honest, but there are others who don't say that. Some of them will say like this. They say, we call Beis Yosef, Chalak, Glatt, all the same thing. They say, all these things, anything with a simple circle, we give the same term to it. In other words, they're just like they say, just like the term Glatt doesn't mean really Glatt. So Glatt and Chalak is the same thing, just one's Yiddish, one's Hebrew. We'll call Glatt, Chalak, Beis Yosef, that's all the same thing. It 100 years ago meant a certain thing, and nowadays it doesn't mean that anymore. So they use this the name, those words interchangeably. In other words, the people who are buying the same, I want to buy Beis Yosef meat or Chalak meat, basically they're not getting that. They're getting the same glatt as everybody else is. And then others say, no, it's not exactly like that. The Beis Yosef or the Chalak meat, we make on a higher standard, but it doesn't mean no sirchas. Even these people are saying there aren't no sirchas, but they're light ones. So for example, they'll say they're making a few assumptions. The first is that if you have something that would come off with habodek, that's the first step. Is if it would come off with habodek, then that's considered chalak. Even the mechaber would have been makel on that. Now, I told you already beforehand, not exactly true. The mechaber doesn't say you could be some habodek. He says if it's a yid's animal and it's Yoreh Hashem Yerabim, under those circumstances you could do it. But by and large, he was not really in favor of being some of that. But that's first step. First step is hachnasis yada boydek would be mutter. And second is, these simple sirchas that are really simple and they're really easy to get off through klipah are equal to the ones that hachnasis yada boydek. Now, of course, the Shulchan Aruch never said that, because the Shulchan Aruch never talked about klipah. I told you it was invented after the Shulchan Aruch was written. So it never talked about that. So this is a conjecture that these sirchas are like the ones that come up with hachnasis yada boydek, and hachnasis yada boydek is mutter. Those are two assumptions, neither of which is necessarily obvious. And therefore, and then they say, so therefore we can call those chalak. So I mentioned to you, so just before I finish, so you realize that the weakness in saying this is that the whole sheet of the mechaber is coming from the Gemara. The Gemara said there's no way to check animals. So anything you come up with that says I have a way to check is not really in the spirit of what the Beis Yosef is saying. The whole point of Beis Yosef is the Shulchan Aruch, the Gemara said is there's no way to check. So you're checking and you're saying this is like this. Anything you're going to come up with is not really in the spirit of what he had in mind. So, but anyhow, we end up with three different standards. Okay, we have three different standards. We have ones who are calling the Chalak or the Beis Yosef actually what was the traditional one. So they're going to have not so much of it. They're going to have a limited supply because, as I said, it's really hard to get meat that's that kosher, that's so clean. The lungs are so clean. There are ones who are giving you a little bit less sirchas, but even so, it has some kind of sirchas, but something less that they said somehow that would be a better standard. And then there are ones who are completely doing whatever they want. Chalak and Beis Yosef and Glatt are all the same, and they're completely interchangeable, and there's no difference between one and the next, and it's just a matter of what the label says, but they're treating them all the same. Okay, so, and if you want to know, I am not going to say it on this recording, but if you want to know, you're going to need to actually check with Rav Machshir to find out really what their standard is. If a person wants to have a higher standard, to find out whether this thing that's called Beis Yosef or Chalak is actually any better of a standard than the meat that there's that's called Glatt. Now, we've been talking all for Ashkenazim, who Ashkenazim hold that the din is they're allowed to eat meat that's not glatt. The Ramo is makel that, or the later poskim to eat meat that was that you did miuch mishmush, and so klipah is like a variation of that, and that's good enough also. But for Sephardim, it seems to have a much more serious shaila to them. because the Machaber didn't hold of miuch mishmush, good chance he wouldn't hold of klipah either. Even hagbah and הכנסת he wasn't very excited about. So that seems to put them into a very difficult situation, because the meat that's made by Ashkenazim seemingly is not going to be good enough. Now, if they knew which meat was truly up to their standard, as I mentioned before, there's different ways to what they call Beis Yosef meat. If they knew which one it was, then they could eat that. But that's not so easy. So, it's a serious question. Now, there are some Sephardim who their whole community is b'chlal, some on this shaila. Some who said that klipah is maybe better than miuch mishmush, and maybe the Machaber wouldn't have held of that. That's not so easy to say, but maybe. But Beis Yosef has a svara, which you also heard a variation of it from Shlomo Miller, to say why maybe Sephardim could be making eat our meat. And that's because there's another machlekes, which is what happens if animal was they shot an animal and then the lungs were lost before anybody got to check them. So the Machaber says that if you lost the lungs, most animals are not treifas and you could eat the meat. And the Ramah is machmir to say that no, you should not be semach on that, and you cannot eat the meat. If you lost the lungs, you're not going to be able to eat the meat. So the Machaber, when I say he's mekel, he's not mekel if you purposely threw the lungs out. But if it was truly out of your control and somehow it got lost, then you let it eat the meat. So Rav says, so, well, let's think about it now. We have you walk into the butcher shop. There's a piece of meat here. Can either Sephardi check the lungs? Of course not. At this point, it's impossible to check the lungs. I don't even know the lungs are long gone. I can't check the lungs at this point. Did anybody do something wrong to get rid of those lungs? No, not at all, because the shechita was done by Ashkenazim. The Ashkenazim who did the shechita, they checked it according to what they were supposed to do. They threw out the lungs when, from their perspective, it was checked properly. They had done exactly what they were supposed to. So there was no malice in getting rid of these lungs. The Ashkenazim did exactly what they were supposed to. So now Sephardi, who walk into the store, I have a piece of meat. The lungs were lost in a way that was not with any, trying to make trouble or trying to get rid of them, to not check. So I could be samech on the roiv, and roiv behemoths are not treifas. They should be able to eat them. Again, that wouldn't work for Ashkenazim, but it would work for Sephardim. Okay, so that's an interesting way of looking at it, to say that the Sephardim could then eat that meat based on Ashkenazi hashgachah. I just want to mention that Ashkenazim eating from Sephardi hashgachas have their own issues. From Sephardi shchitas have their own issues, and that is because in treifas the Sephardim, as I've been telling you, are more machmir. Okay, so that's good. We don't have to worry about that part. But there are lots of things that the Ramah is more machmir on in shchita. I'm going to mention some examples. One of the things that makes a shechita possible, we mentioned last time, is a shehiyah pause. The Ramah is machmir even if it's a tiny pause, and no matter when it happened, the miuch kama, the miuch basra, he says the same thing. Even a tiny bit of a dras and a chalad, the hagram, and each of the 5 hilchos shechita, even the tiniest amount of them, even in the strangest times, and the miuch kama and the miuch basra, all these things he's always machmir on. The things that the Sephardim are not machmir on. So if the Sephardi did a shechita and he had this tiny bit of a chalada, or a tiny bit of a shehiyah, they would be machshavit. That's not good for me. That's good for the Sephardi, not for him. Other things are like what happens if an animal doesn't have a varda? What happens if how we define Kashrus and Kashrus? I mentioned beforehand that the Sephardim follow what seems to be the din for the Gemara and the Ashkenazim machmir. How many minutes to do malicha for, and how do you know which animals are even kosher, which birds are kosher or not kosher? So if an Ashkenazi wants to eat a meat that was made from a Sephardi shechita, he should check beforehand that they're doing it to our chumras also, which they don't have to. They're Sephardim, they could do it according to their kulas about these things. So a person would have to know that they were actually following the chumras that Ashkenazim have also. Because again, in treifas, they're more machmir, but in these other dinim and other examples, we're more machmir. Okay, one last thing is that all the things we've been talking about checking lungs and sirchas, etc., is only done for gases, for large cattle. But we do not do any kind of checking of sirchas checking sirchas to accept them for Dakos, meaning for sheep or goat or veal. Veal are young calves, and that's because these animals, their lungs are softer, and we can't use the same rules of how to decide if something is or is not a sircha for those animals. Now, in truth, most of those, 60, 70, 80% of those animals of lamb are going to be free of sirchas, so that's fine. But lamaisa, we don't do anything to be miuch, mishmush, and klipah, any of that stuff for those animals. So by them, there's no different levels. If it had anything that was even possibly a circle, the animal is going to be treif. Now, because of that, if you think about it, logic says, well, then we don't have to do any bedikas chutz altogether. What's the point of the bedikas chutz? Bedikas chutz, if the bodek pnim found even something at all suspicious, the animal would be treif. We will not be mako with klipah and miuch, mishmush, and things like that. So logically, you would say there should be no need for bedikas chutz. Lamaisa, Ramosha says, is that you should do it. You should do bedikas chutz to check extra, see an extra check, a visual check with inflating it. And lamaisa, so in practice, most places will do bedikas chutz for Dakos also. And once in a while, it'll catch something, but not very commonly. But that's the difference for those.